Good morning. My name is Nell, and I'm a very, very grateful recovering member of Al-Anon. Well, I want to thank you for inviting us to be here, and I think it's only going to be necessary for me to get even with one or two people. Who set this schedule up? You know what you've done? You've not only given Cleve prime time, but rebuttal time. But I'll work on it. It is a privilege to be here and be a part of this celebration. And indeed it is a celebration when a bunch of people like us can get together and share our experience and strength and hope with one another and feel the gratitude that we all feel in these rooms. And I'm grateful to Tom for meeting our plane, and grateful to some special people from Tennessee who have come to be with us this weekend, and grateful to those of you who saw fit to be here this morning. Gosh, this is a big old place. And I'll tell you right now, the only advantage of being up here is that I can see you and your beautiful bunch of people. I'm a bit nervous, but you know that's because I'm in the way right now, so I pray that I'll get out of the way and let my higher power speak through me to you this morning, because I have learned in this fellowship that I have no power, and boy, that was a blow. But I've also learned in this fellowship that I can continue to grow. And as I grow, I have new freedoms. And I like that. Freedom. Freedom from all of the things that created the problems in my life. I have a 3-year-old grandson. And he came running in the other morning and he said, "Nana, Papa said that bad word." I was almost afraid to ask him what that bad word was, you know. But I said, "Well, what word was it, Stephen?" And he said, "Well, it was the no word." And you know, I identified with that. Because when I was growing up, the only word that ever gave me any trouble at all was the no word. But it was then that I learned that I could manipulate people. I had a beautiful mother and a very handsome and loving father. And I found out that with just a little eyelash energy and chin quivering, I could change my daddy's no's to yeses. And so I started out preparing, you might say, for this fellowship when I was quite young. I did not grow up in an alcoholic home. I grew up in a home where I was loved and I was adored. And I knew this. And my brother was born when I was about 7 years old, and my sister was born when I was 19 years old. And we were all raised like only children. But, you know, I never felt that I lost my place when those siblings came along. And now my mother was the wise one in the family. She couldn't be manipulated quite like my father could. And for example, you know, when I threatened to run away from home, she'd help me pack. And she did tacky little things like punish me. And one time she put me in the closet, and I blew my nose on her dresses. And this is the first act of revenge that I can remember. But, you know, in later years, I blew my nose on a lot of people. And I did a lot of tacky things to people to get even. That necessity to get even. Sure makes your mind work. But when I was a teenager, I thought a lot about the boys. And I went to a lot of movies, and I had my screen idols, and this was during the war, the big one, the one that made the papers, you know. And I seemed to be drawn to the pilots because there were a lot of war pictures during that time. And the pilots seemed to have a certain flair that, I really liked. And after the war, I was invited to visit a friend on the campus of the University of Oklahoma. And by the way, there is a person from Nebraska here this morning with a Nebraska T-shirt or sweatshirt just staring me in the face. And I met that young man a year ago about this time in Omaha. And he had the audacity to wear that sweatshirt this morning. But I'll either get even with you or work on forgiveness. We'll see. But anyway, my friend got me a date with a young man who had just returned from the war. And when I saw him, I kind of went over a mental checklist. He had on a tweed coat and argyle socks and loafers, and he was wearing a fraternity pin and smoking a pipe. And I knew he was studying for a profession, and just fit the bill. That was it. And I had a wonderful time. He spent the evening telling me how he won the war, and I believed him. And when he told me good night, he kissed me on the cheek and he gave me a nickel. Now, some of you may not know, but we used to be able to make phone calls for a nickel. And he told me when I became of age to call him. Now, my parents sent me to a girls' school, and I didn't forget that. And we started dating my sophomore year in college and his senior year in law school. And by the way, I don't know whether you can see him or not, but I'd like for him to stand. I want to kind of locate him myself. And there you are. Would you stand, Cleve? He's a cute little thing down here in the pink coat. And I want you to know right now that's a switch. When he drank, he wore black. Black suit, black high heel boots, black hat, black string tie, colored glasses. I stomped that hat in colored glasses one time. Felt good. But when he'd leave the house in the morning, I'd stand at the door and I'd think, well, if anything happens to him, he's dressed for it. And since he's sobered up, I never know whether he's going to look like the ice cream man or the Undertaker. But I'm delighted that he's here because I hate for him to miss any opportunity to hear how much I suffered. It's it's real good for him. Now, I want you to know that I was a planner and I was a dreamer. And when we started dating, I started planning that wedding. And 6 months later, it took place. And he was finishing his senior year, and we had a marvelous time on the campus of the University of Oklahoma. And then we moved to Tulsa for a year. And that was a fun time for me. I grew up in a small southern Oklahoma town, and sort of the Bible Belt, And all I knew about drinking was what I saw in the movies, and I thought that looked wonderful. And I had my first cocktail party in Tulsa. And I felt so grown up and so sophisticated. And drinking was such a fun part of our lives that I certainly didn't see that it would ever create any problems for us. And Cleve was just kind of cute when he, drank a little too much. And I didn't think it would change. After we'd been in Tulsa about a year, we decided to move back to our part of the country. Now, I was raised in Ryan, Oklahoma, and Cleve was raised in Waurika, Oklahoma, and these two towns are about 10 miles apart. And he was quite anxious to hang out his shingle and practice law, and I thought, well, that's all right, because I'll only be 10 miles from my mother and daddy, and I knew that it'd be lean times for us for a while, but if I needed anything, my daddy would get it. And I liked that. So we moved back to Waurika, and they were glad to see us. It isn't a very big town. And we did all the things that were expected of us in the church and in the community, joining the civic clubs and so forth. And there was a young crowd in Waurika then, and we had lots of fun times, lots of bring-your-own-bottle parties. And life was good. And things were happening just as I had planned and just as I had dreamed. And after we'd been there about a year, I decided it was time to start my family, because I was going to have a little boy first and then a little girl. Now, things didn't work out. And I didn't know what was wrong. And someone suggested a specialist in Wichita Falls, Texas, that I might go to. And I made the round of a lot of specialists. And I had a lot of tests. And nothing happened. And finally, one doctor told me, he sat me down, and he said, Nell, in all probability, you'll never bear a child. And here was a no in my life. A no that tears didn't seem to change. And you know, I remembered when I was a little girl, I heard someone say that God was my Heavenly Father. And I liked that, because I could compare that Heavenly Father with my earthly father, and I thought, if he's half as good as my daddy, I've got it made. So I cried, and I went to my Heavenly Father, and I told him how much I wanted this baby. But I thought he said no to me. And since I've come to you, I've learned that God's no's are simply preludes to much better yeses in my life. And how grateful I am to you for the awareness of this, because it gave me another freedom. But at that time, I didn't know that, and I was angry, and I was hurt. Here was a plan, and here was a dream of mine that was not coming true, and I just didn't understand why. Why? Cleve was judge at that time, and he told me, he said, now don't get excited. He said, because I quite often have children come through my court that need and want a home just as badly as we need and want this child. But you know, it didn't happen soon enough. I always had trouble with God's timing in my life. But one day he came home and he said, Nell, there's a little 6-year-old boy that needs a home. What do you think about that? Well, you know, I'd planned on a baby. But I said, well, we'll go see him. And we did, and when I saw him, I knew he was mine. Mike's mother had died of alcoholism, and his father had had a bout with a bottle and a second wife. And Mike climbed up in my lap, and he said, you're my third mother and the goodest one I ever had. God, he punched all my buttons, and I was going to be the goodest mother that he ever had. So I decided we wouldn't drink anymore. And I had a talk with Cleve, and I told him, I said, I thought that in order to give this child the love and the security that he needed, that we just shouldn't drink anymore. And, a strange look came on his face, like fear. And he sat there for a long time, and finally he said, Nell, I'll tell you what, I won't drink in front of the boy. And I thought, well, that's all right. But I never saw him take another drink. And I was excited about this little boy, and how we shopped for him, and everyone in town was excited that we had this little boy. And they had parties for us, and life was good. You see, my plan was beginning to take shape. About 3 years after we adopted Mike, we had an opportunity to adopt a baby girl, but some things had started happening at our house. and I was afraid. In fact, negative feelings that I had known so briefly in my life seemed to come to live with me. There was anger and fear and anxiety and guilt. Because alcoholism was rearing its ugly head. And you know, as it was manifesting itself in Cleve, it was manifesting itself in me. And I didn't know what to do with these negative feelings. You know, always before there had been something, someone, or something that I could change. Things would go my way and I'd be all right. This was different, and somehow I knew it was different. And I was afraid that someone might find out what was happening at our house. And when we got the call about this little girl, I talked to Cleve. I was afraid to talk to him. I was afraid to ask him why, because I was so afraid he would say, "It's you." But this particular day, we sat down, and I said, "I want that baby. I want that baby girl. I feel like she's mine." And he said, "Well, now we're going to get that baby girl. She's just what we need." And I said, "Yes, but you drink too much." And he said, "Well, that's going to change. Things are going to be different. I'm going out of public office into private practice, and things are going to be different." And we drove several hundred miles and picked up a tiny baby girl. She was 5 weeks old and weighed 3.5 pounds. We named her Rebecca, and we brought her home. And life was good. I had my little boy, I had my little girl, I had a wonderful husband that had promised me that things were going to change. And honey, he didn't lie. They got worse. And that old merry-go-round went faster and faster. And I was afraid. And I was full of guilt. And I didn't know what to do. And finally, one day, I talked to someone. But you know, I found out something. Cleve's friends were in denial as much as I had been. They said, oh yeah, he drinks a little too much sometime, Nell, but I don't think it's anything you have to worry about. Maybe he drinks a little too much when he plays golf or celebrates with a client or drowns his sorrows with a client. But I don't think he has a problem. But you know, they didn't know what I knew. They didn't know about the nights that I sat alone and didn't know where he was and was afraid for the phone to ring. And you know, that place that we have by the window, our special place that we have by the window, where we stand and we watch the cars as they come down the street. And you call all the places that you think you might find them, where you think you might find them, and they're not there. And then that imagination goes wild. You know, they're dead. They're bound to be dead along the road somewhere. God, don't let anything happen to him. Let him get home and I'll do it. Fear. But you know, people did find out. They found out what was going on at our house to a degree. But I'll tell you one thing I didn't tell them. I didn't tell him I was knocking the hell out of him when he came through that door. And I'm not proud of that. But alcoholism is a family disease. And you see, I didn't know how to react to this, except to fight back, and with feelings of fear. I went to my doctor and I went to my minister, and they would answer my questions with questions like, how do you stand it and why do you stay? And I didn't know what to tell them. I didn't know why I stayed, and I'd leave their office feeling guilty for loving a drunk. But after I came to you, I found out why I stayed. I stayed because I had become emotionally dependent upon him to fulfill all of my neurotic needs. And if he'd sobered up at that point in time, I'd have probably gone stark raving mad, because I would have lost that whipping post, and I didn't know what to do about me, and I didn't know that I was my problem. And I can look back and I can see where God's timing is good in my life. And you know, when people found out, when they knew that I knew that they knew that I knew that they knew, you know, created a whole new role for me. I went to town without makeup. Oh, God, you look more pitiful that way, you know. Walk up and down Main Street and I'd hear people in the shop saying, God love her. Bless her heart. And I would go in, and invariably someone would put their arm around me and say, oh, Nell, how do you stand it? And I'd just flop my head over and I'd say, I don't know. It was wonderful. It was just wonderful. Don't applaud me too much. I go back to things like that real easy. But you see, I didn't know what to do with these feelings. And I soon grew tired of their pity. And I felt ashamed. And I didn't know why I felt ashamed. We had one couple in Waurika who were attending AA and Al-Anon in Wichita Falls, Texas. Now, we had been to an AA meeting or two with this man. In fact, we'd been to his first birthday. And I thought that Alcoholics Anonymous was a wonderful thing for those people that needed it, but I certainly didn't think Cleve was one of them, you know. They told these horrible things that they did. They had been in jail. Mine hadn't been in jail. And anyway, they asked me if I would like to go to an Al-Anon meeting. And I didn't know what that was, but I said I would go. And since there wasn't a meeting in our town, they drove every week to Wichita Falls, Texas, which is 35 miles from us, to their meeting. And I was sort of excited about getting dressed and going somewhere. And we asked Cleve if he'd like to go, but he said he'd keep the kids. And I went to that meeting, and you know, I walked into a room and there were the loveliest people there. And they were smiling, and I kind of liked that. And they made me feel so welcome. But you know, Waurika's a little town, and everyone had sort of heard what was happening at my house, and here was a group of people who hadn't heard what I was going through. It was a whole new opportunity for me. And so I proceeded to tell them, and I can remember how rude the chairman was that evening. She did tacky things like trying to get control of the meeting and such as that. And they talked a lot about their steps, and occasionally the chairman would pause, and I'd jump right back in there because there were other things that they needed to know, and if they were going to help me. And so I read these things on the wall. They were called steps. And I certainly didn't see any need for most of them as far as I was concerned, but I got to number 12, and I really liked that. It said, carry the message. And I knew then why I was there. I thought, oh, this is where you go to find out how to sober up that drunk in your life. And this is sort of the training program that you go through. And I couldn't wait to get back in that AA room because I knew they had pamphlets and books and things that Cleve was going to need. And I took home several of those things and tastefully decorated the house with them. And I tried to talk to Cleve about this wonderful thing that was going on over there, but he said really ugly things to me when I did. And so they told me not to talk to him when he was drinking, and I would wait and I've sort of indicated to you, I'm not much of a morning person, so I started sacrificing way back then. I would get up, and I'd usually be pretty worn out after the night before, pacing the floor, and sometimes having to go hunting when he got out of pocket. But I found out he was not reading that literature. So when I would get up, I would gather up a little handful of it. I didn't try to give him too much at one time, maybe just one pamphlet. And I'd say, Cleve, I have something wonderful here to share with you. And he'd choke on his coffee and make crazy sounds and say ugly things, but I just did not let that bother me. And I was trying to practice something they were calling detachment. And I read to him. Now, for some reason, these things didn't go over too well with him, and I thought, well, he feels bad. And I'd go back to my meetings, and I know one time we had an AA speaker in our Al-Anon meeting, and he said something like, did you realize that if you take one O out of good, you have God? I thought, oh, that's wonderful. And I just couldn't wait to get home and share that with Cleve. And so the next morning I bounced into the table, and he was there, kind of over his coffee as usual. And I said, Cleve, I heard the most marvelous thing last night. I heard this alcoholic say, did you know that if you took one O out of good, you have God? And Cleve said, oh, good God. For some reason, he just was not impressed with these little gems that I was bringing home to him. And I didn't understand this. I heard a man in Lubbock, Texas say one time that just being related to an alcoholic does not necessarily make you an Al-Anon. And somehow I identified with that when I heard that. But things weren't happening like I wanted them to. And I was talking to this higher power again, and I thought he wasn't hearing me. And I cried a lot. But somehow, things weren't happening. And one night at one of my Al-Anon meetings, I heard a gal say that nobody feels as unloved or as unlovely except the wife of an alcoholic. And I thought, right on. But she added something. She said, unless it's the alcoholic himself. And for some reason, that made sense to me. I heard what she said. And I thought, oh, dear God, is he as lonely as I am? And does he feel as unloved as I do? And just an inkling, not much, but just an inkling of compassion crept in. And I looked at those steps on the wall. And I did not believe I was powerless. And I did not believe that my life was unmanageable, and I did not believe that I was insane, and I thought I had turned my will and my life over to the care of a loving God, and he certainly wasn't cooperating when I tried to help him with things. And Rebecca's first sentence was, is him dead? And she'd come in and she'd say, is he dead? He'd be lying in state in the living room floor, And I would say, no, darling, your daddy's resting, and we'll just play a little game. It's called Jumping Over Daddy. And as I went over him, I kicked him and would say, oops, mother missed. I'll have to do it again. And People say, look what the alcoholic is doing to his family. But when I looked back and truly got honest, I was the one who did it to the family. They knew what he was going to do. He was going to be drunk. But they darn sure didn't know what I was going to do or how I would react. They'd told me in Al-Anon to tell the children their daddy was sick. And it confused the little things when I knocked the hell out of their poor sick daddy. Alcoholism is a family disease. I can remember an afternoon that I had some girls coming over to play bridge, and for some reason old Cleve shows up. There he stands in that old black suit, black hat, black boots, black tie, colored glasses. And I said, "What are you doing here?" Well, that was my first mistake, He was just drunker than the Lord. And I said, "Well, you can't stay because I have friends coming. We're going to have a table of bridge." Well, he informed me that he was staying, so I said, "Go to the basement." And he did. Well, the girls came. We set the table up, and, we're dealing those cards. And you know how we can have that look on our face. Everything's just all right. And I'm dealing those cards. Mike comes in the back door, and he's screaming, "Hey, Mom, he's getting out. What are we going to do?" Had that old boy caged, and he was loose. But you see, this was a situation that I had created. Had I just let him go on into the bedroom, things might have been different. I heard a tape by Chuck C. from California. Many of you will remember him. And in this particular talk, he told the story of the prodigal son, and he wove that beautiful story into the story of recovery in the program of Alcoholics Anonymous. And I thought, I've got to get hold of that tape. That's going to save old Cleve's soul. And they let me have it. Now, I took that tape home, and I presented Cleve the opportunity of hearing it. And he refused. So I thought, well, I'll play it cool this time. I certainly won't insist. But every day, I offered to play that tape for him. And every day, he refused. Now, God knew that this thing was going to do it. And I told God, I said, now, all you have to do is just show me the way to play this tape for him. And one afternoon, I was in the beauty shop, and I picked up a magazine, and it said, "Learn a foreign language in your sleep." And I said, "Thank you, God." And I went home, and I put that tape player under the bed, and I had to let him back in the bedroom. You know how we sacrifice. And as soon as he was asleep, all I had to do was reach down, flick on that button, and on came Chuck C., the prodigal son, the whole bit. And I thought he would be saved and sanctified the next morning. And he was drunk by 10 o'clock. So I had to let him back in the bedroom. And night after night after night, I played that tape for him. And it wasn't long before he developed a very deep resentment for Chuck C., the prodigal son, and me. Nothing was working. Nothing was working. And I want to tell you something. It's hard being married to a drunk lawyer. I threatened to divorce him, and he offered to represent me. I'll tell you how sick I was. I made an appointment. I couldn't afford him. But you see, he had told me that he always wanted me to have the best. And I believed him. I believed him. I had met a couple, or we had met a couple in Wichita Falls. Occasionally, Cleve would go to meetings. Sure wasn't taking, and what all the help I was giving him wasn't taking. And I'd been in Al-Anon for 3.5 years. We'd met this couple that were very dear to me, and I want to tell you why they were. They loved Cleve. And you know, I was tired of people not loving Cleve. And they'd come by our house, and it was okay if he was drunk. I didn't have to hide him. And I didn't have to make excuses for him, because they loved me and they loved Cleve. And all the things that I had heard in those AA meetings happened to us during that 3-year period. There was jail. And there were lots of nights that I would get my children out of bed and drive the streets and the alleys looking for this man. And all the time, these kids begging to stay at home. And all the time, I was telling them that I wasn't that kind of mother. And I didn't know what my problem was. One afternoon, Cleve was in jail. And Mike was real upset about it, the way some kids had told him about it, and I took to my rocker. Now, this was where I could really be pitiful. And I rocked Rebecca until her feet drug the floor. Because you see, when you're sitting in that rocker and you have a child in your lap and one over here and maybe the dog over here, you know, and somebody comes to that front door and they see this, and the door's unlocked, the screen is unlatched, and all you have to do is say, "Come in." Well, you know what they're going to say. What's wrong? And you can tell them. And I'd also found out that if you don't take your makeup off, it streaks real good. Tammy Baker would make a wonderful Al-Anon. And Corny and Ruby Dee came by that afternoon, and they looked at me in that rocker, and Corny made that fatal mistake. He says, "What's wrong?" And I proceeded to tell him about Cleve's latest drunk, and that he was in jail, and how humiliated we all were. And finally, he just stopped me. And he said, "Nell, there isn't anything that you can tell me about Cleve's drinking that I don't already know, because you see, honey, he's an alcoholic. Nell, what's your problem?" And you know, I heard what he said. And oh, I thank God for that man. I thank God that he came by that day, and that God put those words in his mouth, and that God allowed me to hear. Because all of a sudden I knew that Cleve was not my problem. And those years spent with you were not in vain. You'd been giving me something in spite of me all that time. And I know now it was a vision beyond my circumstances. And because of that, I stayed. In spite of me, I stayed. And you'll never know how grateful I am to those who put up with me. But I'm more grateful to this man who had the courage to say, "What is your problem?" And I knew that he loved me when he said that. And all of a sudden, some of these things just seemed to flood my being. And I cried out to this loving God. And I told him, I said, I've tried to help you and you didn't listen. So I'm going to give Cleve to you. You see, I got even with God that day. And oh, God, help me. And oh my, he has. We're told simply to share what we were like, what happened, and how things are in our lives today due to the program. And I think this is the part that I love best. When I can share with you the things that were given to me, I help repay my debt. But somehow there is a deep joy in sharing these things. I hope there are new people here. And if I don't say anything else, I want to tell you this. Just keep coming back. About 3 weeks after I took my first step, Cleve took his last drink. Again, God's timing. I know that I had to hit bottom as surely as he did before I could look up, before I could take your hand and walk with you down that path. But he felt that release. The whole family felt that release. And things started changing in our lives. Would you believe I didn't even offer to be Cleve's sponsor? I was better already. I had such a job on my hands, I didn't have time for him anymore. And sobriety didn't solve my problems. Sobriety revealed my problems. And you know, when all the people in town were telling me how wonderful I was, I didn't believe I was full of hate and anger and resentment. But oh, how it surfaced in sobriety. I was no longer precious and pitiful as they had told me I was. I had lots of problems. And I didn't know what to do with this hate. And I didn't know what to do with the anger. And I talked to my sponsor and she said, Nell, you just simply do the things at hand that you can handle with God's loving care. And you leave the rest to him. And honey, one day he'll take care of that too. And I believed her. Because I was finding out this thing that has become so important to me, that the awareness of each new truth in this program does give me a new freedom.
This is the end of side 1. Please stop your machine now and turn the tape over for side 2.
And I knew that I had forgiven, but most of all, I knew that I had been forgiven. And for me, these things have to go hand in hand. I don't think I would have ever known forgiveness had I not forgiven. And I have a little thing I keep pasted in my Odette that reads, he who cannot forgive others breaks the bridge over which he himself must cross if he would ever reach heaven. For everyone has need of forgiveness. And I had a freedom. I had a freedom to love this man as I should love him. Not the love that I planned and I dreamed about. It was the loving for free that you taught me about. Loving him for the child of God that he's meant to be. And out of that has come a good marriage. A marriage that I can't plan and dream about, But a marriage that's lasted 40 years, good and bad. And we celebrated June the 5th of this year. Had to quit telling people I was 39. But you know that's okay. Now, I'm not going to tell you that things are just perfect with us all the time. They're not. Because we're God's very human kids. But how grateful I am that we have a program. We each have a program where we can deal with our own feelings. And somehow when I get straightened out with myself and he's straightened out with himself, we're okay as a couple. And life is good for us. And we're still very active in our meetings. I have 2 meetings a week, and Cleve has 3, and we work with a lot of people, and we go a lot. And we've been around this thing. I've been here for 27 years, and he's been here for 24. And oh, thank God. You're applauding yourselves, you know that. But thank God we are ever aware of the need for people like you in our lives. Because you see, I could quickly revert back. My gut reaction to the no's in my life are somewhat like they were a long time ago. But I can do something about them quickly. Because I'm aware of the better yeses today. I have proof of better yeses. I have proof of this thing that you gave me early on when I didn't even want it. And I still deal with my children. Mike will be 39 this month. He's winding down his time, his 20 years in the Navy. And he married his high school sweetheart, and they had 3 wonderful kids. And last year they divorced. They're in Jacksonville, Florida, and they don't know how fortunate they are because I'm in Waurika, Oklahoma. Because you know what I want to do? I want to help them. I want to fix that thing. But I know I can't. And the one thing that you have done for me is impress on me that God loves my kids more than I do. And I was keenly aware of this when Mike was at sea the last time, off the coast of Lebanon. And this was right after the truck had been driven into the Marine barracks and all the Marines had been killed. And they were threatening to do the same to his ship. He was aboard the Eisenhower, a carrier. And I was full of fear. You see, these feelings come back when new situations arise. But they don't live with me as long. Because of your gentle reminders that there's a situation that I can do nothing about but place God very lovingly, Mike very lovingly in God's hands. And that I did. And he came home. But shortly before he came home, I had a letter from him. And he said, Mom, I think it's time that I see. And he named his natural father by name. And you know, a strange thing happened about a year after we adopted Mike. Cleve and I were sharing at a meeting in Wichita Falls, Texas, and there were some people there from Dallas. And a woman came up to me after I had talked, and she said, it's really none of my business, but would you mind telling me if Mike's last name was so-and-so? And I said, yes, it was. And she said, Nell, I'm his great aunt. You see, God had put this woman in my life for a reason. And I knew who to call to get his natural father's address. And I placed that call, and I got that address. And I had it ready for him when he came home. His wife and children had been with us during this time. Now, I watched him several evenings pass by the phone and hesitate and start to make that call, and then he'd walk away. And we didn't say anything to him because, you know, a wonderful thing had happened to Cleve and I. We realized that we could let him go to do this if it was a need in his life. And we also knew that we couldn't deny him any source of love. And he finally made the call, and it was good. It was good. And they wanted to see him. And they made a date. And I gathered up pictures of Mike during his growing up years. And I sent with them when they went to see him. This was right before Christmas. And his father told him, he said, you know, this is the best Christmas present I've ever had. I knew what he meant, because Mike was the best Christmas present we'd ever had. And I was able to sit down and write that man a letter and thank him for the years I had had with his son. That summer, Mike came home again. And he said, Mom, I think we'll go back and see him again. But I'd like to go next week because, you see, this week is my birthday. And I want to be here at home for my birthday. Nothing to lose when you set them free. Nothing. Rebecca's a different story. I have to release her on a daily basis. She lives in Wichita Falls, Texas, and she calls all the time. And she's just delightful. But she is the little manager in the family. And when she went away to college, she came home every weekend, and her only decent grade was in long distance collect. And then she decided she would quit school and go to work, and I told her she couldn't get a job, but she did. She's been with Merrill Lynch for about 10 years now. Wonderful job. And, you know, I didn't like her boyfriends. And her daddy didn't like them either, but he was the one that kept his mouth shut. I didn't. I tried to point out things to her that she needed to know. And one day I was so whipped down with this, and it was New Year's Eve, and I had gotten an ODAT at the clubhouse, and I thought I want to give Rebecca this ODAT. And I wrote her a little note, and I placed the ODAT on her pillow, and I didn't mark a page. And in this note I told her that I loved her enough to let her go. I could let her go and make her choices, be they right or be they wrong. And you know, as a result of that, we have a wonderful relationship. And one of the things that happened was sort of neat, and I like to tell this. It's one of my favorite stories about her. She started sending me flowers. Now, Rebecca and her father have much the same relationship that I had with my father. And we commented on these flowers, you know, and it wasn't long before I had a neat little stack of florist cards, and they had sweet little things on them. I love you, Mom, and have a good day, Mom. And it wasn't long before Cleve had a neat little stack of florist bills. She's no dummy. When she married, her father was judge, and she asked him to perform the ceremony, and you know who did all the work. They walked down the aisle, arm in arm, and then he turns around and whole show. But isn't that wonderful? Isn't that wonderful? She didn't even have the kind of wedding I wanted her to. But somehow it turned out to be the most beautiful wedding I think I've ever seen. And she has this little boy. And he's such a neat little kid. And we put him on our calendar. And we keep him sometime. And I had him about 2 weeks ago, and while they were on a little trip, and one morning he got up, and he's quite a breakfast eater, and he wanted 1 egg fried and 1 scrambled. And I fixed it. And the morning before he left, he said, he woke me up and he said, "Nana, get up. I'm really hungry." And I said, "Well, give me a kiss." And he did. And I said, "Gosh, your mom's going to get you tomorrow and I'm going to be so sad. What'll I do, Stephen?" He said, "Well, Nana, get a Kleenex." He's only 3 and he knows how to release and completely detach. And you know, she picked a fine young man, even without my help. And they have a good marriage. Remember the baby I prayed for? God's timing again. Certainly wasn't the time that I would have picked. We'd been in the program about 4 years, and I'd quit smoking and felt kind of weird, and I told Cleve that I thought I was in nicotine withdrawal, and he said, "Well, I've heard of that happening. Why don't you go to the doctor?" And I did, and I was pregnant. So I went home and I said, "Well, we're just living proof that you don't have to smoke and drink to have a good time." And in December of 1968, I gave birth to Christopher. And you know, we had planned and we had dreamed and we had talked about this child, and the whole family was excited, and somehow we knew it would be a little boy. But when he was born, some of these hopes were shattered because, you see, our baby had Down syndrome. And I wasn't going to let this be, and I just wasn't going to let it stay that way. So day after day I prayed for God to just change that condition in this child. He was such a precious baby, and I loved him so much. And I didn't want anything to be wrong with him. But you know, God looked on his heart, and he didn't see anything to change. He only saw love in its purest form, and he performed perhaps the greatest miracle of all. He changed us and truly granted us the serenity to accept that which we could not change. And you know, just as in that first reality of acceptance, I experienced it again. And I knew that acceptance was not resignation. I knew the difference between hope and expectations. In hope there was trust in this loving God, because you see, you still impressed on me that there was a vision there, a vision beyond my circumstances. I knew there was a better yes in my life. And as a result, I have a child that has given me perhaps some of the greatest gifts I have ever known. When he was about 9 months old, he sat alone. And this in itself was a wonderful thing to take place, because we didn't know what he would do. We didn't know whether he would walk or not. But he sat alone. And I had him on my lap, and I was looking at him. And if you've ever seen a Down's child, they all look like little brothers and sisters. And the little slanted eyes. And I was thinking about how much I loved each so-called little defect. And it dawned on me. Now, this is how God loves you. Just as you are. With all of your defects of character, now God loves you And you know, He rejoices in your accomplishments and in your growth, even though it's slow. What greater gift could a mother be given? What greater gift? God loves me just like I am. But the gifts have been many. On a daily basis, He is a gift. You know, we were able to keep him at home for 12 years. We had a class in public school, and as I told you, Waurika is a small town, and we lost that class later. But at this point, we didn't know that we would lose it, and it was fun to visit that little class, because much like our fellowship, the kids were wonderful. There was no competition, and they just loved each other and rejoiced in each other's accomplishments. And I couldn't wait for them to have assembly programs at the school, because they would use this little class. And one day, I knew it was the last assembly program for me, because they could no longer afford to have this class. I was angry. But, again, you had told me that God could handle this, and He loved us, and He loved Chris. And as I sat there in that program that morning and watched the other children receive all kinds of awards, it was an awards assembly, and scholastic and academic and perfect attendance and all that stuff. And finally they gave a certificate to the kids that had read 25 books or more. And they'd gone all through the grades, and you can imagine my surprise when Christopher's teacher went to the podium. And she said, I too have a certificate to give this morning. Christopher Largent has read one book. And my heart stood still. Because you see, Christopher was the best he could be. God in His wisdom has given me a beautiful example of this program in the form of Christopher. How grateful I am. My joys are many. And I thought, if I could have just let my other kids be the best they could be. If I had just not placed all of my expectations on them. I can't go back and change that. But I don't have to be that way anymore with them. Another gift of the program. I have so many. The awareness of new truths give us another freedom. You know, when I have my family together, I look at each one, and I'm able to count the better yeses in my life. I'm able to see God's timing. And I deeply feel the gratitude that I owe people like you. When Christopher was 8, he went to camp for the first time. He couldn't say camp, he called it hamp. He also called the courthouse the whorehouse. And you know what I did with that? Tell him where Daddy works, honey. And we bought the sleeping bag, and we put the name tags in his clothes, and we were all so excited, because he had never gone away from us and stayed. And you know, he was looking forward to this, because he embraces each new experience in reality. And he couldn't wait to go. And we got to the camp. And he bailed out of the car, and he ran up to the first person he saw, and he said, "Hi, Hamp." And the lady said, "Well, my name is Barbara." And he said, "Oh." And so he ran into the registration table, and he went up to each adult at the registration table, and he'd get right down in their face, and he'd say, "Hi, Hamp." And they, in turn, would tell him their name. And he was really, beginning to think he was in the wrong place. And we went on down to his cabin, and a fine-looking young man came out of the cabin, and I ran ahead to kind of tell him, well, fix it a little bit, And Chris ran up to this young man, and he said, "Hi, Hamp." Rick stuck out his hand, and he said, "Hi, Christopher, I'm Camp." And oh, the look on that little guy's face. And I knew how he felt. I knew exactly how he felt, because when I came to you, I didn't know who you were or what you were. You held out your arms to me and you said, "Hi, Nell, I'm Al-Anon." And like Chris, I stayed. Oh, thank God I stayed. You've given me my life. You've done this simply by sharing your experience and your strength and hope with me. You have given me the vision. And I thank you, because today I can be here to share mine with you, and how grateful I am for that. Bless you.
This tape was produced by Happy Trudge Audio, Roanoke, Virginia. For a list of other tapes available, please write Happy Trudge